Alrighty, welcome back. We're set for panel 3, and so I'm going to turn the podium over to another alum, Andre Monette, who is now a water resources attorney in Washington, D.C. at Best and Krieger, and a 2006 graduate. And Andre, the dice is yours.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Just want to say thank you to Professor Adler for having me. I'm just moderating, but still an honor to be here. And I want to comment on how amazing the conversation has been this morning so far. I'm learning so much, and just a great sharing of ideas here. So really spectacular so far. So with me today, we have Professor Bonnie Keeler. She's the Associate Professor and Co-Director of the Center for Science, Technology, and Environmental Policy at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. We have Professor David Keiser. He's a professor in the Department of Resource Economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. We have Professor J.B. Ruhl. He's the David Daniels Allen Distinguished Chair of Law at Vanderbilt University School of Law. And he also serves as the director of the program on law, innovation, and the co-director of the Energy, Environment, and Land Use program. And certainly not least, we have Professor James Salzman. He is the Donald Bren Distinguished Professor of Environmental Law at UCLA School of Law and the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management at UC Santa Barbara. And of course, I want to reiterate the comments from this morning that the biographies are available in the materials online, and there's much more, obviously, that I couldn't mention here. So please take a look, and you'll see the credentials we have. So with that, I'll hand it over to the panel. I think we're starting with Professor Keiser. No, sorry, Keeler, excuse me.
Great, thanks. So good afternoon, thanks, it's lovely to be here. I was telling Elizabeth over lunch that it's been a long time since I've sat in a room with really smart people listening intently to things that I care a lot about. So thanks for that experience. So I teach at a policy school, and I'm really motivated by a very pragmatic desire to inform water policy, to assess trade-offs, to ensure that we're making a good return on investment, that we're using the resources that we have available to achieve multiple objectives. And so my focus here is to do a bit of a retrospective and look back at how we've done that in the past with respect to clean water policies. How have we evaluated if these are good investments? What kinds of methods have dominated that assessment? And what values have we assessed? And what values have we not assessed in that? So I'm going to be focusing on economic analyses that we use to determine regulatory review. So for these kinds of major federal rules or regulations, what do we know about the costs and benefits? And I'm going to start by drawing on the work of Dave, and Sheila and others mentioned this. This is a paper that was talked about earlier where Dave really nicely summarizes how we spend a lot of money on water quality. We spend a lot of money on water quality policies. And his analysis has revealed that we're not always able to demonstrate using our traditional economic tools that those investments have yielded a positive return on investment. Not just in the US, but economists evaluating the EU's Water Framework Directive similarly did not find a positive benefit to cost ratio. So I think many people find this surprising, and I give a lot of credit to Dave and his team for raising awareness of this issue. It also presents a really important sort of dilemma, I think, for those of us who care and believe in the kinds of water policies that we're talking about today. So, of course, we are not done with our water quality challenges, and this uncertainty in benefit-cost analysis comes at a time when we're debating many, many different kinds of implications for water quality at the local, state, and federal level. And as others have mentioned, there will continue to be a need for regulatory review of the Clean Water Act, as well as all the programs ranging from the Farm Bill to infrastructure expenditures, and of course, all of the ongoing Supreme Court battles about the extent of the Clean Water Act. At the same time, we also face ongoing threats to water quality. So we no longer have rivers that catch on fire here in Cleveland, but we have many second-order water quality problems, including new contaminants. People have mentioned PFAS, microplastics, pharmaceuticals, agricultural contaminants. These are expensive to remove, they're expensive to prevent, and the benefits of further investments in improving and addressing these water quality impairments are often quite uncertain. So that raises the question, do we have a toolkit, a policy analysis and economic analysis toolkit that's fit to purpose for what we see coming at us in the future? And I'm actually approaching this from a very personal level in that I have the ability as an academic to decide what kind of things I want to work on, and I want to do work on the methods that matter the most, that are going to really elevate what are good, strategic, important clean water policies. So to that end, I'm motivated by these research questions. What have we learned about the value of clean water based on our existing tools of policy analysis? What values have we captured? What values are underrepresented? And what gaps need to be addressed for next generation water evaluation? So this comes against the backdrop of what people have mentioned, of a couple of memos and guidance from the Biden administration. The first day of office, this Modernizing Regulatory Review memo, which directs the OIRA to think about how they can fully quantify regulatory benefits that are difficult or impossible to quantify, and also account for distributional consequences of regulations, including qualitative and quantitative analyses, and looking at how regulatory initiatives appropriately benefit and do not inappropriately burden disadvantaged, vulnerable, or marginalized communities. And then shortly after, we've seen a lot of movement around the administration's commitment to the Justice 40 initiative, which is a whole-of-government approach dedicated to delivering at least 40% of the overall benefits of federal investments to disadvantaged communities. So these kinds of recommendations around equity and distribution have been in place in the past. It's not like this is a completely new requirement, but I think we all know that this sort of guidance has been not really well implemented in practice. So there's a clear case right now to pay a lot of attention to distribution and equity considerations. And I don't think this is just a fad. I think there's been a fundamental shift in our awareness of the role of race and class on environmental outcomes and the disproportionate delivery of benefits and burdens. And public is demanding this, policymakers are demanding it, my students are demanding it. I think we really have to speak to these issues. And that means applying methods of policy analysis that address these issues of equity. The other case that I want to make is that water is really special, and I think we'd all agree about that here in this room, but I think there's some particular aspects of water quality that mean that we can't use climate change policy or air pollution policy as a direct parallel. So first, water quality affects a diversity of values. So if you look at this slide, there's recreation, there's human health, there's property values, cultural values, waterfowl, a whole bunch of different ways in which water affects human well-being that are material and immaterial, their use, their non-use, their health, recreation. The second is that there's a diversity of endpoints. We've talked about that also. Groundwater, surface water, lakes, rivers, streams, wetlands, coastal areas. Third, there's a diversity of constituents. Nutrients, phosphorus, PFAS, chemicals, etc. And there's a diversity of beneficiaries. So we're looking at values that might accrue to tribal communities, values that accrue to lakeshore property owners, drinking water consumers, recreationists, people who fish and hunt, a whole set of different beneficiaries. People do not have strong emotional connections with carbon, but they have incredibly strong emotional connections to water. And so I think we have to really take that into consideration when we think about water policy. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about hedonics and travel costs much because Sheila talked about it, but for the non-economists, there are a couple. I'm just going to review some of the main ways that we've been able to collect evidence on the value of clean water policies. So travel cost methods really look at people's behavior of where they recreate. So this is, I think, one of the best examples of this was done, and Dave was involved in this group as well at Iowa State, looking at surveys of recreationists. So they'd ask, how many lakes have you recreated in? Where did you go? How far did you travel? From people's travel behavior, it reveals the preferences they have for clean water. So people tend to travel further to go to clean lakes, they visit those lakes more often, and from that we can infer that they value the value of water quality in their recreational behavior. And then similarly, in hedonic markets, we're looking at the impacts on property values of improved water quality. So those are some of the lines of evidence that we have to understand the value of clean water. The other big bucket are stated preference surveys. So these essentially ask people, one way or another, what are you willing to pay for clean water? So a couple of examples, we had a survey in Minnesota that's been broadly applied that asked, what would you be willing to pay for a 40% reduction in phosphorus loading to the Minnesota River? I'd be willing to pay $140 a year for my household to have that reduction. Some of the studies that have been really critical in evaluating the Clean Water Act and the latest economic analyses include studies that ask people about the value of wetland protection, because that's been a critical area. So you would show someone a photograph of a wetland type, in this case in Kentucky, and you would say, would you voluntarily contribute to a wetland protection fund that would preserve this wetland area? And the assumption is if it wasn't protected, it would be mined. So these are, I guess the other method I'll mention is that people use choice experiments. So they look at, here's some photos of a blue lake and a green lake and a blue-green lake. And you might ask people, okay, you're on a weekend trip and you have to figure out which lake to go to. Which lake are you gonna go to? One is much further away than the other one. One has a smell and odor problem. The other one has a boat launch next to it, right? And so you say, okay, under those conditions, I would go to this lake, I would go to that lake, okay? From those statements, we can infer how much value people place on water quality. So there's some assumptions in this analysis. First is the assumption that values for clean water can be expressed through these kinds of consumer choice models, that we observe preferences at the level of the individual, at the margin. So we're asking people, would you be willing to pay this much more? If water's cleaner, how would your behavior change? So it's really sort of trying to simulate, to the extent, a market like we would if you're going to the grocery store and saying, would you pay more for free-trade coffee than for your regular coffee? We assume then that people are rational, right? That they have full information, and that they have well-formed preferences. And this relates to the overall theory that this fits into, which is about a definition of efficiency that asks us to maximize net social welfare. And in that definition, we assume those who gain could compensate the losers and still be better off. That's the Calder-Higgs criterion. So we're really trying to make the pie well-being as big as possible, and then not worrying so much about the distribution of that pie. And that would be the definition of efficiency that economists would typically use. So if we think about those assumptions as almost like a funnel of that big, complicated mess of water values, then there's some implications of that, right? So not all benefits are going to be valued. The preferences of the rich are going to receive more weight than the preferences of the poor. Historical and social contexts are not directly considered because we're often looking at a baseline and just the sort of marginal change. And also we're obviously missing other policy criteria like equity or fairness or feasibility. Okay, so quickly, I spent some time just reviewing some of the regulatory impact analyses and economic analyses that under the Clean Water Act. Here's just 3, and the highlighted are all things that say no benefits. No benefits. We could not figure out what the benefits were. All right, so this says missing. We can't figure it out. We don't know how to measure it. We couldn't quantify it. We couldn't analyze the benefits. So regardless of the administration, regardless of the year, there's just lots and lots of missing benefits when you look under the hood of these Clean Water Act economic analyses. I won't go into the details on this because that was actually really lovely well articulated in the previous panel. But if you think about the stuff that economists can monetize, that's a lot of it comes to recreation and travel costs. There's big barriers to entry for those markets. You need to have a car and a boat if you're going to be a water recreationist. If you're going to value property values, you need to be a homeowner. This is a picture of an estate on Lake of the Isles in Minneapolis that's worth over $4 million. So if you were to use the hedonic analysis that says if you have a 0.1 meter increase in clarity, that you would get a 1% increase in price, then we're talking about $40,000 worth of benefits for just that one household. I don't think that most of us would want to allocate the majority of our water quality dollars to improve property values of the highest value homes. Further, we know that wealth distribution and the majority of people's wealth is tied up in home ownership. In Minneapolis, like many other cities, because of decades of racially restrictive housing policies, we had huge disparities in home ownership. About 75% of white families in Minneapolis own their home, and about 25% of black families own their home. So there's clearly a bias here in terms of whose preferences are going to be expressed. And then finally, even with the stated preference approaches, if you're asking people for what their willingness to pay is a function of your ability to pay. So there's another case there where we're in a very unequal society, as we have those consumer choice methods of eliciting value are going to bias the preferences of the rich over the preferences of the poor. Okay. I'll be really quick here. These are 2 law articles that I read in preparation for this panel that I found really interesting, that basically make a case for the importance of historical context and how the Clean Water Act has been applied, in one case to tribal communities and then other into the Anacostia River, as it compares to the Potomac, in terms of what actually happened with the implementation of those policies. And pretty damning implications for inequitable application of the legal framework provided under the Clean Water Act. And of course, there are, as I mentioned, extremely deep cultural significance with water that we haven't fully talked about today. I come from, the Twin Cities, which is the ancestral and current homelands of the Dakota people. This is the confluence of the Minnesota and the Mississippi River. The origin story of the Dakota people is that they arose from this point in the river. They didn't come to Minnesota from elsewhere. And so you can imagine someone going in and being like, what are you willing to pay for your ancestral homelands? So we have big problems, I think, trying to apply some of these typical tools from economics to these places. Water is an incredibly sacred cultural value for a lot of communities. It's also the #1 value for environmental justice area groups. So this is a survey from the Midwest Environmental Justice Network that showed that water was the primary issue of concern for those groups. So if we listen to EJ groups, we have to focus on water. They're incredibly concerned about it. Okay, so here's the situation. We have a toolkit. We have this mandate from the federal government that we need to think about distributional benefits and benefits to disadvantaged communities. We need to move beyond efficiency. We know that different methods are going to reveal different values and therefore prioritize different types of decisions. We haven't done much, but need to do a lot more in thinking how we combine different disciplinary approaches to policy analysis to really understand the full breadth of impacts of environmental policies. And so here are some closing thoughts. One, we need to quantify more benefits. 2, we need to evaluate the impact of equity weights. We have, I think, more to do on that. I think we need to reflect on the value of technocracy versus democracy. So I just spent a week listening to the Society for Benefit Cost Analysis, which is very much came down to this debate about technocrats versus politicians and who should be deciding what we value and how to value things. I think if we've learned stuff from the environmental justice community, the focus needs to not just be on product, but on process. And I was intrigued by Elizabeth's comments on how EPA is embracing that. I think we need creative ways to deal with these really taboo trade-offs. This is something we have to think about with water that we don't necessarily have to think about in some other environmental contaminants. All methods are biased, some are useful. We should use all the ones at our disposal, but recognize that none of them are necessarily objective and some are less. Economists have not cornered the market on rigor, despite what they would like to believe. And therefore, we have to proceed with transparency and humility. Thanks.
Great. First of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. It's a real honor to be a part of this group, so thank you. And it's also a real treat to be in the same session as Bonnie. And for the reason that I believe she already knows that, but she helped encourage and helped kind of energize and help motivate the research that we present today, which is joint with Tina and Darjay and Yang Ji. And just to provide a little bit of background for this, and Bonnie already went over a number of these things, so I'll try not to repeat myself here. But last year, Bonnie and I, as well as Sheila, who you heard from earlier, and a number of other individuals were engaged in a review, external review of the economic analyses that supported the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. And while we were doing that review, as Bonnie already pointed out, the Biden administration published this memo directing the Office of Management and Budget to think carefully through about modernizing the regulatory review process. And as Bonnie already mentioned, a key component of this memo was a real focus on thinking about the distributional consequences of regulations, and really ties in nicely with also EPA's big push on environmental justice issues. And so what we were interested in doing is trying to think a bit more broadly about also not just with WOTUS and water quality, but just more broadly, how can we think about modernizing regulatory review of the Clean Water Act, and also how can we think about actually starting to operationalize a new take on looking at the distributional consequences of water quality policy. And so a natural jumping off point for us was this paper that I recently, Bonnie mentioned this as well, but recently published with Joe Shapiro and Kathy Kling, where what we did was we looked through an analysis of the costs and benefits of major water quality policies and programs over the last several decades. And that really focused on the efficiency of these. So what are the benefits, the measured benefits and the measured costs of these policies? But what we missed out on and what we didn't consider were the potential distributional consequences of them. And one of the things that's kind of nice about starting with this list for us is that we looked at a number of effluent limitation guidelines and the analyses that were done for those, and EPA is required to also conduct an environmental justice analysis for those effluent limitation guidelines. So we started to dig in a little bit to see what they had to say. And this is a fairly new area for me, but one of the things that I thought was interesting is that for many of these effluent limitation guideline analyses, they kind of they took a very similar approach and kind of came to similar conclusions. So the Steam Electric Rule in 2015, what it states here is that EPA conducted two types of analyses. One analysis was to compare statistically how demographic characteristics of residents living near these facilities compare to national and state averages. And then two, for a limited subset of the benefits that they could measure, were there any kind of distributional considerations that EPA should be aware of. And what you see is similar tables to this, where this comes from this analysis, and it states that it shows the population living within a certain distance of a stream reach where one of these facilities was in, and the characteristics of the individuals that live within a close proximity to them. And what you see here is that within a close distance, the share of the population that is minority is actually below the United States average. But then when we look at the share of the population that's below the poverty level, it's above the United States average. And a similar table, I don't have it here in the slides, but a similar table was done for state averages as well. And what EPA ultimately concludes is that EPA determines that these final guidelines will not deny communities from the benefits of environmental improvements, basically because the individuals that are living in these areas are going to be at least somewhat similar to the national and state averages, or potentially that the benefits will accrue more to individuals that are communities of color, or communities that are living, say, below the poverty line. And you find this in similar kind of language and similar kind of analysis in some of these other effluent limitation guidelines analyses. This is from the metal products and machinery, where they state again here they're comparing the socioeconomic characteristics of populations living in these counties, and they find that they're very similar to the state averages. And maybe we can save this for discussion at the end, but there's another type of analysis that's done here where this is for the meat and poultry products, and you see this in other similar kinds of analyses where they state they don't believe that this rulemaking will have a disproportionate effect on minority or low-income communities because the technology will be applied uniformly across the U.S. Now, to me, I'm not sure that's the criteria we want to think about using for analyzing environmental justice as it comes to water pollution, but this is the flavor, at least from my review of some of these analyses that were done as to how EPA had been thinking about environmental justice as it relates to a certain part of the Clean Water Act. So what we wanted to do in this work was to think, well, how could we use some data and more broadly try to analyze to what extent our water pollution industry is correlated with things like race, poverty, and education. And this is the location of these facilities as well as the discharge of water pollution that's coming from these facilities. And do we see any correlation from this discharge with these same type of factors? And the reason why we're pursuing this is that although there's a very large environmental justice literature, to our, again, maybe limited understanding, we've seen that a lot of that is focused on air pollution and toxics, and the focus that has been on water has been focused on toxics. And again, I'm really happy if someone points out that we were wrong here, but we couldn't find a very large kind of comprehensive analysis to say what are, where are we most worried about environmental justice issues as it relates to water quality policies and programs. So we're also interested then in taking this data, trying to think about what are some key challenges to modernizing the regulatory review of the Clean Water Act. You could probably cross out Clean Water Act and just say clean water policies more broadly. So the approach that we're going to take is we use data from about 100,000 outfalls across the United States on about 11 different industrial categories. We're going to combine that information on the location of the facility as well as the pollution that's coming out of the facility with information on race, poverty, and education from at census block group levels. This data is coming from 2 decennial censuses in 1990 and 2000, and then also information from the American Community Survey from the U.S. Census in 2013 and 2019. This is when we could get the information that we wanted on demographics. And then I will try not to bore you on some of the empirical approaches that we take, but essentially what we do is we construct what we call pseudo-Lorenz curves. Lorenz curves are oftentimes used to think about looking at income inequality. We borrow that approach a little bit to think about, can we see at least visually how water pollution is potentially correlated with these demographics. And then I won't spend a lot of time on it today, but hopefully it's coming later, but we also approach this with some different statistical techniques to see if there's correlation, again, between demographics and water pollution, not focusing, of course, on causality, but just focusing on correlation between these demographics and water pollution. So what we find that water pollution is somewhat regressive for the population below the poverty threshold and below college education, or for communities that have a higher share of below college and above education. We find that it's somewhat, I'll say, progressive for population with higher share of non-white. And this is somewhat similar to the table that we just showed you for the steam electric rule. There is, though, some heterogeneity across industry, so as EPA starts to move forward and thinking about modernizing the regulatory review process for water, this might point out a couple of industries to perhaps start focusing on a little bit sooner than others. Now, what I'm going to show you is all about pollution. It has nothing to say currently about benefits or costs. And I do think that there will be some really potentially big hurdles, but also we're going forward trying to do this for benefits and costs. Okay, let's see here. So in terms of the data, what we have here is just really quickly, we split this up into 11 different industries. And the 4 biggest ones in terms of the presence of facilities include electric and gas, manufacturing, mining, and sanitation or sanitation services. And what we see is that these facilities across these major industries are located in about 3 to 10% of census block groups across the U.S. The share that is non-white tends to be below the national average. Again, something that we saw in that steam electric Ruhl table. But where we see these industries located tend to locate are in areas with a higher share of the population that does not have a college degree or higher. And it's also somewhat mixed, but also perhaps a little bit higher in areas with a higher share of the population that's below the poverty line. And then lastly, one of the things that we've kind of encountered in doing this analysis, and something we knew a little bit going into it beforehand as well, is that the data on water pollution, what's coming out of these facilities, we're a little bit worried about perhaps the quality of that data and the availability of that data. And what you see here is that for a measure of the water quality that we come up with, which is a kind of standard water quality index, the share of facilities that report the data that we can use is somewhat low compared to the total amount of facilities. So this is just to show you that we have pretty comprehensive coverage across the United States. These are the 4 primary industries. Okay, so I'll jump right into the results. I'll walk through this slide a little bit slower, because then I'll show you really quickly a bunch of other slides that look very similar to this. So these are these pseudo-Lorenz curves that I talked about before. On the x-axis, we're getting a normalized measure of the demographics that we're going to focus in on, and ranking a normalized ranking of census block groups based on certain demographics. And on the left, what you see is this is the share that is non-white. In the middle, this is the share below the poverty line. On the right, this is the share below college and above education. And on the y-axis, you could think of this as the normalized cumulative sum of the outcome that we're looking at here. So in this case, this is the count of facilities that fall within a certain industrial classification. For this one, this is manufacturing. And so what you have is a 45-degree, the green line is a 45-degree line. Anything to the upper left quadrant, you could think of this as somewhat progressive. Anything to the bottom right part of the green line, this is somewhat regressive. And so we're also plotting this for 1990, 2000, 2013, and 2019. One of the things to see is that those curves don't really move much over time. So this seems to be somewhat relatively stable over this time period. But again, we're seeing somewhat similar as what the summary statistics show and what the steam electric Ruhl suggested. Again, that these facilities tend to be somewhat in locations that have higher white share of the population that's white. They tend to be in areas with a higher share of the population that's below the poverty line, and really tend to locate in areas where the share of the population, there's a higher share of the population without a college or above degree. I know you can't see all of these pictures, and I apologize for the panelists up here because they really can't see it. But what this is trying to show you is this is across 11 different industries. And the main thing I want you to see is, are these curves up to the left of a 45-degree line? Are they below to the right? Or are they along that? And the key takeaway here is that this is the share on white, and across all of these 11 different industrial groups, we tend to see that this follows a similar pattern as the one that I've just talked about. When we look at this for the share below the poverty line, again, fairly similar kind of findings that we found before. So not a whole lot of heterogeneity across industries. Some industries a little bit better than other industries. And then when we look for non-college, we're again seeing that this relationship tends to be, again, these industries tend to be located in these areas with, again, a higher share of the population that does not have a college degree. And this is just showing you electric and gas. So these, I showed you manufacturing, electric and gas follows a similar type of period, similar type of diagram, although a little bit more equally distributed in terms of non-share below the poverty line. This is mining. You see a little bit of a change, a bit more of a change over time for the mining category. Part of this, though, we want to be a little hesitant to read too much into the 1990 line just because the data is a little bit more sparse. Unitary services. So just for the sake of time, I know I'm running out of time. I'm going to just go through this in 2 seconds for the water quality measures. by far, what they tend to show is that these are, you can think of these as these kind of icicle graphs, where the further down they are, the worse water pollution. I think one takeaway from this is that we have a lot less data in 1990 and 2000 as we do in 2013, 2019. They tend to support the same kind of picture that we get from the Bren curves, except for we're trying to figure out a puzzle as to why we get somewhat opposite results when we look at discharges for below the poverty line as we do for Lorenz curves, but again, we get a similar type of picture when we look at the share of the population below a college education. So I will just stop with, I know I'm out of time, I'll stop with this slide here, but again, just to reiterate, what we find here is somewhat regressive in terms of water pollution, industries, locations for population below the poverty threshold and below college education. The industries that we see really jumping out are that tend to not be as equally distributed across these demographics are mining, manufacturing, and wholesale trade, although these tend to be somewhat relatively stable over time. And I think that maybe I'll just leave it here as some questions for you all as well as the other panelists up here is that what do we do when we have missing data from EPA in terms of trying to think about doing these types of analyses? Some of the missing data might have to do with systematic missing data that's correlated with the demographics. So this type of analysis, if we want to use it for thinking about modernizing regulatory review, would be important to understanding what that missing data looks like and the pattern of that missing data before we draw too many hard conclusions off of this work. And then as we move forward to benefits, one of the things that I think is a really important but difficult thing to do in a space on water is to measure the benefits of water quality improvements. And so I think maybe a first step, if we want to try to operationalize modernizing regulatory review, is just to think about, well, where are these facilities located? What does the pollution look like? And then more likely than not, that may be correlated with benefits. There are certainly some caveats there, but as we move into measuring these benefits, can we do similar types of analyses to look for the distributional consequences of water quality policies? So thanks a lot. Really fun to be here, and I will pass it on.
All right, so while they bring ours up, first I just wanted to start by thanking Jonathan for inviting us. It's been a real delight to be among friends and colleagues. Again, what he didn't know is that this publication marks the 25th article or book that JB and I have written together. So it's a silver anniversary of sorts. So this is the photo that while we're all here, right? This is the signing of the Clean Water Act. But as Jonathan started off today's session showing us, there's more to here than meets the eye. So many of you may not know this. Nixon vetoed the Clean Water Act. And so even though he's smiling here, I think it's more of a grimace than it's amazing. It was passed, his veto was overridden, not unanimously, but I think close to it. I mean, it's hard to imagine that happening today. And so we're going to talk about 404, but not what is a wetland, but how do you try to conserve wetlands? Because in a sense, when I teach the Clean Water Act, wetlands are kind of weird, right? 404 is kind of weird in the sense that you don't really think wetlands when you're thinking, discharge at effluent, the sort of Dickensian vision of pollution. So why do we care about wetlands in the Clean Water Act? Well, it's because of the ecosystem services that wetlands provide, right? In particular, water purification, but more generally, if you sort of think holistically, which is a word we thought about a lot today, it's sort of storing water, it's habitat, it's all these things that this slide shows very well. Now, it's interesting to note that the word wetland does not appear in the Clean Water Act, but it's equally interesting to note that the word bog, marsh, swamp doesn't appear in the Clean Water Act either. Wetlands really were not a focus when the Clean Water Act was passed. And in the paper that we provide with this, we're going to sort of go into more detail, but you really can think about the history of wetlands and wetland mitigation in three broad phases. So the first really is when the sort of in the lead up to the Clean Water Act in the first 5 years or so, where Section 404 wetlands really were thought of as part of the navigable waters part. So I was actually, Jonathan, when you sent out the email yesterday to the Environmental For-Ops listserv, I got an email immediately from Gus Speth, who is like this giant in the environmental law field, co-founder of NRDC, head of the Council on Environmental Quality, and he said, I litigated Callaway. So when he was a young lawyer at Natural Resource Defense Council, he was the one who actually brought this case, and I said, tell me what happened. And he said, basically, the Corps put out these rules saying they're only going to enforce 404 for dredging and filling of navigable waters that were really navigable. Right? They had a very narrow view. Gus and NRDC won that case, and basically they said, no, this is the whole water of the United States that we heard about earlier. By the time that you get to Riverside Bayview, the notion, this very much goes into what Bob was talking about earlier, it's much of an ecological sense of what the waters are. And then mitigation takes over, which I'm going to talk about a bit more in detail, and then GD is going to take over the second half and talk more about the ecosystem services aspect of this. So what is 404 for those of you who are not Clean Water Act mavens? So basically it says that if you're going to dredge, dredging and filling navigable waters or filling navigable waters is prohibited unless you get a permit. The permit is under Section 404, that's why it's called a 404 permit, and there are a series of things you have to show in order to get one. I've always loved the fact that you have to say no statutory violations will occur. I always took that as a given. But anyway, interestingly, it's primarily administered by the Corps of Engineers, right, which is weird, right, because the rest of EPA has a veto authority, and there's your typical ag lobby exemption for application. So we basically are in the late 1980s, and this is where the sort of wetlands mitigation banking story really starts. And it starts because of basically a campaign platform that George H.W. Bush announced. And he basically, this is a quote, it was a speech at Ducks Unlimited. And he basically said, whenever one thinks the three key words of the Bush administration, it's read my lips. But there was a second for environmentalists, which was no net loss. And so, what does no net loss mean for wetlands? And there are ways to avoid impacts, but the wetlands mitigation hierarchy that became important was mitigation banks. So what was happening was that the Corps was allowing destruction of dredging and filling of wetlands to take place so long as you mitigated right next to it by the permittee. It was in-kind, in-place mitigation. And the problem was it didn't work very well, and they were kind of postage stamped. And so a bunch of state highway departments who fill a lot of wetlands had this idea of a mitigation bank, where they basically, usually a farm, and basically replumb it to turn it into a restored wetland. And after the George H.W. Bush idea of no net loss, and the focus on the political property rights movement to really put wetlands protection in the crosshairs of regulatory programs that are under attack, in the 1990s you get an explosion of wetlands mitigation banking. So basically you get these private companies who come in and they construct a mitigation bank, and you have the developer who needs the permits, or needs the credits, I should say, and you've got a regulating agency. A few things to realize about this very quickly. This is a purely artificial market, right? So if Bonnie were to sell JB a bicycle, JB cares about the quality because he's paying for it, and Bonnie cares about the quality because she's trying to get the right price for it. That's not this deal, right? Neither Bonnie nor JB care. If Bonnie's the developer and JB is the banker, none of them care about the quality. Right? Bonnie wants a permit, JB wants cash. The only person in this exchange who cares about quality is the regulator, and that was a big problem with the Corps in the first 10 years of this story. They've gotten better. Corps has gotten better. This is sort of cares about the quality question, but there's some issues. So JB and I wrote an article in 2001 that basically pointed out that the currency that was used for wetlands banking trades was acreage, which is, if you care about the ecosystem services provided, a terrible metric to measure this, right? So that became an issue. Where are the ecosystem services? Where's the value about this? The government did some studies following on this, and they basically said we have no idea if there's no net loss because we can't measure what we care about. No net loss of what? Sure, there's no net loss of acreage, but who cares about that if you really care about the services? We also did a paper together a few years later where we found in Florida there was a net migration of 15 miles from the impact site to the banking site. That might be fine if you care about habitat. It's not fine if you care about service provision like clean drinking water and things like that. And so JB and I became, in a sense, kind of the bad boys of the mitigation banking world, and there was a lot of we weren't the only people writing this. Dennis King was writing it from the economist side, Todd Bendor did work from the geography side, but there were a bunch of academics who were saying there's some real problems here. And that led to the Corps, in part, to revise its guidelines.
Yeah, so just a couple of thoughts before I jump back into the core regulation. As Jim pointed out, this is an artificial, it's a market created by a regulatory instrument. And the question from earlier today, should we be relying more on markets? On the one hand, it worked very elegantly to sort of create these banks. But the question is, well, what's in the market? Like, what does this market care about? And the whole point of this study and several others, Todd Bendor, there's about 15 that sort of came from the late 90s to the mid 2000s. Well, what about the ecosystem services, the actual economic benefits to humans that we derive from well-functioning ecosystems? The whole mindset behind 404 was focused on bugs and bugs, the sort of the habitat, the benefits for the particular type of wetland ecosystem. So even if you accept that an average distance from impact site to bank of 15 miles, some as far as 80 miles away in the Florida study, is a net even for bugs and bunnies. It can't be for people. I mean, right, if the ecosystem services generally are local, obviously carbon is global, but all those, the water filtration, the water storage, then moving them 15 miles without accounting for that in this market could be problematic. And the EPA in particular responded to this research. And I mean, I wasn't inside the room, but my sense is that the EPA was pushing on the Corps to, in their joint compensatory mitigation rule, 2008, to integrate ecosystem services somehow. And this is the language that compensatory mitigation should be located where it is most likely to successfully replace lost functions and services. We're going to take this into account. Then they also, in this rule, pointed out, that's really hard. We don't know how to do that. And in the history of sort of ecosystem services policy, this is the first embodiment of ecosystem services values in federal regulatory text. I mean, CFR. Got some agencies talking about it in guidance, etc. But now it's in hard law. But the law got a little bit ahead of science, I would say, in that we didn't have the science to account for ecosystem services losses and gains at that kind of granular in the field level. So they recognize that. The whole point of what Jim and I are hoping to do in this paper is now it's 2022. They said they were going to do this in 2008. What have they done? Where has this gone? Also want to point out that they were not alone. Soon after, the Forest Service, in their revamp in 2012 of their forest planning rule, integrated ecosystem services extensively, including creating methodology for assessment in forest planning, and they have a lot of research about the value of trees, and they're really out there assessing the ecosystem service values of the forests, national forests that they manage. Also, a very big development that kind of dropped out of the blue in the Obama administration was that OMB, and this goes to kind of the whole, how do we quantify these? So all those not monetized, no benefits. So OMB and CEQ issued a memo to all departments and agencies saying, look, we're tired of having this not monetized, no benefits to be calculated. Tell us how you are going to identify, describe, and quantify ecosystem services. How are you doing it now? How are you going to do it? And we're going to, in fact, give you guidance once we figure out what everyone's doing. Now, when OMB says jump, federal agencies jump. But we all know what happened. They had a big, handoff ready to go. and the administration that won wasn't interested. Fortunately, Ecosystem Services just kind of went dormant. It did not attract the unraveling. And so now we're in a position in the Biden administration to ask, what do we want to do now? Have the 2008 regs been implemented? How could we find out? Naively, Jim and I thought, oh, well, we'll just go on the Corps of Engineers database, download, all the EISs and records of decisions for like 5 coastal cities, and we'll read through them and we'll code them. Well, there's one problem. You can't do that. The Corps does not have a database like that. You essentially have to hunt and peck through 3 different databases. Ribbits, the Corps Permit Finder. I thought, well, that's obvious. That's where I want to find these permits. It's just a list of permits. There's no links to anything external to this list. So you have to kind of guess and decide, well, this permit might be a kind of permit that would involve an ecosystem service analysis. And then you have to FOIA the Corps, and then you wait, and then you get either a letter saying, couldn't find anything, or here you go. And we did that as kind of a small test case and found very little useful. In some cases, it was clear that the permit activity probably didn't, have any ecosystem services trade-offs. In some where they did, I think, Jim, you found that it was sort of a qualitative, just, no, don't worry, not a problem. So we also search, high and low for, is there internal policy? Do they have this kind of assessment methodology? Nothing. We still want to bottom all that out, but the bottom line is, if you wanted to find this out, you would have to, hire teams of RAs and just be FOIA, and construct the database in that sense versus having one available. But same findings, we still don't know really how compensatory mitigation is working, in particular when you take into account the ecosystem services impacts on people. So it's a potential doctoral thesis. If any of you PhD students would like to join us. It's unclear whether this is intentional or just low priority, but it would be easy to fix. It's 2022. Okay, they have the documents. It's easy enough to put them into some kind of a database that. Find out. Now, why is that important? Well, first of all, they have the resources. They have the Institute for Water Research that does a tremendous amount of research on the civil works side of the Corps of Engineers. And we have an economist at Maryland who's helping them think about ecosystem services impacts on that side of the Corps, which is not the same. There's no corollary over on the 404 regulatory side that we can find. Now, why does this matter? There's a lot of research coming out about urban ecosystem services, how important they are, even junky ones. That was one of the criticisms that we had. Well, you guys are talking about urban wetland impacts and the banks around here in the rural areas where they're beautiful, and those are just junky wetlands. Well, they may be junky for bugs and bunnies. They're not beautiful, but they're serving local ecosystem services values, and it's going to be incredibly important, increasingly important with climate change. So these urban, junky, accidental wetlands are actually tremendously valuable to those urban populations. We see it as an environmental justice issue. They're going to become more important. And these trade-offs are being made by this market in which, the people who are being affected by the market aren't participating. They can't find out without, kind of research you'd expect in a doctoral dissertation. What is the impact? What's happening to our community as these wetlands are filled and the values are being transferred out to, 10, 15 miles away? So we think greater public knowledge could at least impact site permitting and mitigation bank locations, but also inform urban populations about the effects of this regulatory market on their community. Great. We're done.
Okay, so we now have time for questions. Start with Professor Button.
This is probably mostly for JB, and first, all the presentations are great and fascinating, and I admire people who have actual methodological skills when they present. We law professors are famous for having no method, but a lot of opinions. But but for JB and Jim, under 404, the Army Corps has long had its public interest review. Have you thought of doing just a very focused FOIA request just to get any particular year's 404 public interest reviews to see if they do anything that would, because it would seem to logically fit there as part of a public interest review in 404 permitting. Because I think often with any of these agencies, you do a FOIA request, the problem is that it's, you know, it's a morass, and so the response is either nothing at all or they don't even know where to look. And so
It's a good suggestion, and we didn't look at the public interest. I will say what we're looking for is something that's technical. Or it would be
looking for what?
something that is technical. We want to know, did the Corps actually try to assess the services? There's actually, when the banks are permitted, mitigation banks, they actually do an analysis of the services that are provided by the bank. What's missing is what are the services that are provided at the development site, and how do those compare? They talk about them qualitatively, but there's no real sort of quantitative assessment. But we will look at the public interest part.
Yeah, just those factors, the public interest review factors, many of them match up kind of nicely with what could be, you know, called an ecosystem service. Some don't, but the full package of services really is not. You know, the public interest review is really aimed right at that, nor is it aimed exactly at the question we were asking, which is the translocation of ecosystem services that's going on systematically from wetlands mitigation banking, the way it's practiced, is not really being captured.
My question is for David, I guess. Can you tell, you have some time series, but can you tell if the population came to the pollutant or the pollutant came to the population? Because that might matter, but is it possible to even tell?
That's a fabulous question, and I'd have to think through it a bit more, and there are other people that have given that a lot more thought than I have. That's probably really difficult to do from a statistical perspective, just because you have that, what Sheila talked about before, that endogeneity concern. So I can keep rambling, but no, I think that's a really tough, good question. There's maybe some new data sets now that are kind of, in some ways, scary in how much they track individuals and how they move and where they live and move over time. I've used that a little bit in some work of mine focused on Flint, but I think that maybe if there's certain unexpected shocks of industries being in certain locations, then we could possibly try to use that to then see how that changes demographics. So I'd say there's certainly the potential for it, and maybe others have already done it. I'm just not aware of it. But I think it's a really great question, but I think a tough one to answer.
I had a question. This is for Bonnie. So I was looking at the table. Actually, I guess both of you, because it's based on your research. Where you got all these projects that have been implemented. They don't do well in benefit cost ratio, which suggests to me, well, that's probably just, then why do we care about that measure if we know that it's probably wrong? I mean, because one way to look at it is say, well, you know, we can get it right. Another is to say, you know, you're not going to be able to screw in a screw with a sponge, right? We're just using the wrong tool.
It's a great question. I mean, I think that why should we care from, I think it depends on like what perspective you're also looking from. So for full disclosure, I was working with a nonprofit that was interested in trying to understand a bit more about some economic analyses that EPA is thinking about for more effluent limitation guidelines. And one of the things that I've heard is that for a long time, some of the nonprofits didn't really care so much. Hopefully this isn't too much of a blanket statement. They didn't care so much about the benefit cost ratios. But what they found is that sometimes, and this is a non-lawyer speaking, is that courts do care about it. And so I think what this is suggesting, at least from what I try to suggest, is that this provides a very perplexing question and issue for us. So if we have these benefit cost ratios that are very low, is that indeed the case and maybe we should be pulling back? Or as what I think it is that it's a call for more research and better research that can try to measure the benefits of water pollution control. And my understanding is that kind of the air field ran into similar types of issues, but many decades ago they're having also difficult times measuring some of the benefits. And so I think that from a researcher's perspective, I think we should care about it because it's suggesting that we need to do a better job, potentially better job, making sure we feel very confident in the methods that we're using to measure.
Hi, my question is for David Keiser as well. I was wondering, can you, when you look at progressivity in the context of your study, can you explain that again? Generally in tax, when the rate increases with the income, that's progressive, and then when the rate increases with a decrease in income or the base, then that is regressive. And then the second question I have is, can you explain why you look at the non-white population only, and is that a percentage or a total or an aggregate number?
Sure, and great questions. First question, I actually, when I was on the plane here as well, thinking about these slides, this is the intimidating part of presenting in front of lawyers that are very particular and good about words and meanings. The meanings of those words. For economists, not so much so. At least for this economist, not so much so. So I don't know if progressive is the right term to use there. Honestly, what we were trying to think about is there a simple way that we can describe whether or not the measure of harm, in this case the presence of facility, tends to disproportionately impact communities that oftentimes are thought of as being disadvantaged in terms of communities, minority communities and communities below the poverty line. So that was what we were thinking about there. Sorry, your second question was?
So just based on what you said, the number of facilities that are near populations with less than college education is higher, and the number of facilities is higher where there's a greater poverty.
Yep.
And
then they're lower in areas that are predominantly non.
So that non-white is a proportion, it's a percentage of the population, or is it an aggregate number?
So we look at a census block group and we look at the share of the population that is non-white. And when you ask about race, then that'll remind me of your second question. We have looked at a number of just for the sake of time today, we group this into a share non-white, but we have looked at similar kinds of analyses for the share Black or African American. We also look at a separate question that asks about the share that is Hispanic or Latino, and we find similar results, a little bit slightly different, but similar kind of results as when we kind of classify this as a share non-white.
Okay, great, thanks a lot.
Yes, another question for Bonnie and David. Especially Bonnie, when you were presenting and describing some of the assumptions made in economic analysis, you talked about the Kaldor-Hicks criterion and how that assumption essentially assumes a theoretical lump sum compensation from the losers, let's say, of regulatory initiative or policy to the winners of the beneficiaries of such policy or regulation. Is Kaldor, in order to account for some distributive factors, would that require moving on from Kaldor-Hicks and that assumption, or should Kaldor-Hicks somehow make that theoretical compensation a practical reality to other legal or program or framework, which that, in my mind, opens such a big can of worms. But whenever I am talking about moving beyond Kaldor-Hicks criterion, something that comes to my mind is, for instance, the social welfare function protocol. I don't know if you're familiar with. It's a lost Adler brother that is not here, but it's essentially a theoretical that explores the mechanics of this framework. Do you have any impressions as to that model?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, this gets at what are the objectives of our policy analysis and the trade-offs associated with defining that in different ways. And so, one way is to say, let's make the pie as big as possible. Let's maximize net social welfare and not worry too much about how it's divided up. But if we can make it bigger, then that's better than not making it bigger, right? And then you could say, well, what are we going to do about the distributional impacts of that? So now if we've made the pie bigger, which is good, and we want to pick policies that make the pie as big as possible, do we also have a responsibility then to reallocate that to address those disparities? And so economists have backed away from that and been saying, like, that's not ours to evaluate. Like, we just can tell you what the impacts on net social welfare are. We're not going to say this is how it should be distributed. So then there are other ways that people have talked about other frameworks of measuring well-being. You could think of like a max-min approach. You could say, like, let's have a criteria where we want to apply policies that raise benefits for the lowest income households, or we establish we want the benefits of policies to at least raise the minimum in addition to maximizing social welfare. Or you could use like a Marchesand capabilities framework where you think about that's your criteria, and then you're trying to address people's multiple criteria analysis for different capabilities. Or you can look at the social welfare function that Matt Adler and others have written about. People have put ideas out there about these different aspects. I don't think there's been a lot of critical comparative work on what the practical implications of them are. We have this theory, and everybody's developed different theories, and then there's the theory and practice and what it actually looks like. And I would love to see more like comparative work. There's a lot of theoretical critiques of economic analysis, but very little practical implementation of alternatives. And I think that means that we keep falling back on methods that we've got really, we're really well exercised in.
Professor Ryan, and then.
Thank you. So my question is probably most focused to Jim and JB, but maybe for the whole panel. And it's really about the intersection of the environmental justice concerns that Bonnie and David have talked about and the ecosystem services innovation that you guys have been at the forefront of. And I remember when it was happening, this wonderful idea of how to encapsulate some of the how to maybe move towards quantifying and at least counting some of the benefits of keeping water in stream that had been missed in earlier cost-benefit analysis, made the ecosystem services model so powerful. But this panel is making me think about how we might disaggregate pieces of the ecosystem services panoply into parts that are more susceptible to environmental justice problems and less susceptible to environmental justice problems. And so the bugs and bunnies features seem to be less tied to environmental justice problems, but some of the recreational and scenic benefits that we associate with waterways seem to be more connected with potential environmental justice problems. And so I'm sure that I may be having this thought for the first time. I'm sure that there's a rich literature of people who have thought about this in much greater detail, probably the two of you. But I wonder how you would think about that. Do we need to be more precise and more discerning when we think about ecosystem services in this new conversation where we're going to do better, says EPA and the Biden administration, about thinking about environmental justice concerns?
Yeah, that's a great question. As I suggested in my half of the talk, there is an increasing attention to urban ecosystem services as both a climate change justice issue, and it's just basically an environmental justice issue. To your point, your specific question, actually Kalyani Robbins, a colleague, a law professor at Loyola Chicago, is presenting, I think she's one of the abstracts that we chose. If not, she's working on this very question, the environmental justice of ecosystem services, and are they, is our policy sort of thinking about that specifically versus just, and there are, their ecosystem services they vary tremendously. Like there's, carbon, we manage for carbon, we might not be really maximizing some of the local ecosystem services. So those are policy decisions we have to make as well.
I could just comment, and based on my experience working on urban ecosystem services, in many watersheds, they're not a term that resonates well with environmental justice communities. And in a lot of cases where we've come in with sort of this lead of nature-based solutions or the benefits of urban nature, what I have heard back from community members is, that sounds like gentrification and displacement to me. So I think we have to be really careful in how we take that term and apply it in an environmental justice framework. And it's not a term that I think resonates really well with the environmental justice community in my experience.
Professor Mendelson?
Thanks to all of you for great remarks today. My question, partly inspired by Dr. Keeler's presentation, is for Dr. Keiser about your data. I'm just curious to know if can you hear me okay?
Yep.
I'm just curious to know if you took into account a couple of factors in your data. One is whether the distance from the facility, if you will, is sort of along the waterfront or away from the waterfront, inland, because I wonder if that might affect some of your findings. And the other is essentially size of acreage. And I couldn't quite understand whether you were looking at your data based on poverty and non-white status based on kind of blocks of property owners or individual property owners, but I was curious to know if you looked at either of those, size of acreage of individual holdings and whether the location that you're measuring from is along the shoreline or inland.
Both excellent questions. We're still fairly kind of new into some of the data analysis. So we don't do this in terms of the distance along the waterfront. And some separate work, have a program that can help us search pretty nicely upstream and downstream from particular locations using a hydrologic map of the United States. It's something that we've thought about doing here. We don't have that currently. It's a great point. And then we don't consider the different, currently don't consider the different sizes of the census block groups themselves, but again, something that could potentially lead to some mismeasurement between the characteristics of the census block groups and the presence of facilities. So both excellent comments and things that I've jotted down that we need to do. Thank you.
This is a question that could perhaps equally well have been asked at this morning's second panel. Many of the considerations, the interventions associated with the Clean Water Act result in costs that tend to be borne early and benefits that tend to be strung out in time. And so the manner in which that disparity is handled quantitatively has or could have a considerable impact on findings. And that issue has sporadically been examined. Well, certainly there were in the Senate in 1952. So I mean, it's an issue that sporadically surfaces and garners attention for essentially for most of your lives, not quite mine. The question is this: is there any state of the art that's generally accepted now as best practice?
I mean, so there's lots of environmental issues where the benefits and costs are disconnected in time. So climate change, I think, is another example where we're having to bear lots of costs right now and the benefits may not be realized for into the future, maybe even future generations. Economists deal with that through discounting. And of course, there's a lot of normative assumptions based on how you value benefits that occur in the future relative to the present, especially when you're valuing impacts to future generations that aren't currently living. And so there's a whole kind of ethical and debate around what the appropriate discount rate is, but that's sort of the best attempt to try and internalize those benefits that happen in the future and put them in present terms. Water pollution is a whole nother deal though too, because there's lots of like legacy, like phosphorus sticks around for a long time in sediments, and you could do something and not see the impacts for decades. And I think that's a real problem in terms of trying to also make a public case for the investments that we make in improving water quality. I can say in Minnesota, we've been dumping tons of water, tons of money into improving our waterways, and we're getting these like little tiny, incremental impacts that we may not really see for a long time.
Another way of viewing the question, and one of the things I find most interesting about thinking of the Clean Water Act and CIDWA, the Safe Drinking Water Act, you've got three very different possible funding sources. First, it could be the federal government, which loans or grants, and those are very different things. But in many respects, we haven't talked about it, in many respects, I think the most important impact of the Clean Water Act was the money that came in the first decade. I mean, if you really look at the difference it made, and that was basically, those are grants. You've got the polluters, right? You want the polluter to pay, but you've also got the users, right? And this is a big deal. We're not talking about the Safe Drinking Water Act in this conference, but that was why Nixon opposed the Safe Drinking Water Act, as he thought that the ratepayers should cover all the costs. And these issues are still very much in play 50 years on.
Some questions down in front, down here.
Hello. I'm trying to understand the context for the term urban ecosystem services. Is that the Drinking Water Act, or when you talk about Section 404? Because I'm hearing this like juxtaposition between like animals and insects versus race and people, and it's getting confusing, so I'm just kind of wondering about that.
So when a teacher hears that, you think I did a bad job. It's basically a lot of things, which means we weren't clear in setting it out. So 404 is the permit program if you dredge and fill navigable waters, which in practice tends to be wetlands. What JB and I showed in our research and others did was that when these wetlands are being filled and the loss is being mitigated by basically cheap farmland somewhere else, you were generally losing the local services, and they were being stored somewhere else, which means that if the value that they're local, that's lost. A lot of places they were being lost were in urban areas. And so the urban ecosystem services, the loss of those is what we particularly care about right now. I hope that clears it up.
I guess I mean, one of the things I'm starting to see more as I read and learn more about environmental law is how things are connected, especially hydrologically. So, you can't see the boundaries as much. So when you say urban ecosystem service, I'm like, how do you measure where the boundaries are in terms of, we've lost the service. So if you have like habitat somewhere else and you have bees, they are providing food, urban agriculture somewhere else, possibly. So I guess it's just, I'm trying to get that into context.
Yeah, so I think our focus on urban ecosystem services for this purpose is just to put a spotlight on the fact that there are what we might consider not pretty wetlands that are benefiting urban populations. That are, Section 404 allows them to be filled if you compensate for the loss. And that was, Wetlands Mitigation Banking sort of greased that wheel beautifully, but they wound up sticking the banks out in the middle of nowhere and only really considering the ecological value to nature in general versus the trade-off between people.
We should talk afterwards.
Yeah,
economic benefit too to the urban area because you have
sure,
more people.
Of course, maybe they want a shopping center, but they're not given all the information that I would, that you would normally want to have to make decisions like that, and they may be benefiting from the honey that's being, sure, but all of those should go into the mix. We have a hole here. We've created a regulatory market that isn't taking into account everything that you would expect it to take into account in a well-functioning market.
To kind of concretize the question that she asked, do you guys have a good example of the kinds of things, the ways to mediate the problem of stormwater runoff given the number of people who drowned in New York City with the recent excessive rainfall and in other cities? Like, what could have been done as an alternative in terms of ecosystem services to slow the water or prevent all of those basements from flooding so quickly and resulting in drowning? Are there techniques or ways of dealing with that in terms of ecosystem services in urban areas?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll be brief because I see some other hands. Engineers always face the choice between nature-based solutions and green and gray infrastructure. Right, and so New York, you may have read stories about this, is basically creating these huge caverns where the stormwater is just going to drop down, and hopefully that will be enough. In many cases, a nature-based solution doesn't make sense, given the geography and the need. Sometimes it does. The Catskills, New York City water, it did. Other places it won't. One of the key foci of the whole ecosystem service movement, I've been involved in it now for almost 25 years, is for engineers to at least consider that there's an option to a built infrastructure solution. And that, Philadelphia has been a leader on this. I don't know about Cleveland, but, a lot of cities are looking at it differently than they did 2 decades ago.
Thank you for these great presentations. And all three of them raise an issue that I've long found maddening about cost-benefit analysis in the environmental sphere, which is, you have all these instances where it's known there's a benefit. The problem is we can't put a number on it. And that gets translated to zero. And that strikes me as there should be an intermediate step in there. And Justice Stevens had a great dissent in one of the cooling water intake cases where that's what was done in the cost-benefit analysis, is all that long list of benefits we knew were there got translated to zero because they couldn't be monetized. So my question is there a way to do a qualitative cost-benefit analysis? And why, if there is, why hasn't that been incorporated more?
Yeah, and there are lots of ways to measure these things. It's not that we don't have any idea what's going on if we can't put a number on it, right? And so I think part of the frustration is, how do you take those qualitative analyses? How do you take those descriptive analyses? How do you take things that are even in biophysical terms? We can't put a dollar value on it, but it's still really important. And what happens in theory, like, there's no reason why we can't do that, right? The information is there, so let's put it together where it makes sense. In practice, when you try to put everything into a benefit-cost ratio, you have to let all that go. And we don't necessarily have to, that's a choice that analysts make. It's a choice that policy analysts make. It's a choice I try to help my students navigate when you're thinking about what it is that what information are you gonna bring into decision-making. I think we need better standards and examples of what a real pluralistic, comprehensive, multidimensional, qualitative and quantitative practice looks like for regulatory review. And it's something I want to see more examples of what that looks like.
Just one comment. I don't need the mic. Dr. Keiser, you mentioned that you were looking for examples of environmental justice in the water industry. You were having luck finding them.
So not that they weren't examples, but a very large kind of comprehensive analysis that could say in what industries or what water quality policies would we think.
So I just wanted to mention if you haven't looked into it, then NACWA, National Association of Clean Water Agencies, just created an environmental justice committee, and they kicked that off in March. So you're right. Basically, there is a gap there, and that's being worked on. I guess it's one thing to mention. And then the other thing I want to give a shout out is, I just heard to talk about the EJ tool that EPA has. I don't know if you've checked that out, but that's pretty cool. The way they can take demographics, and it sounds like it's right up your alley. It's not my thing, but so like.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, sure. Just want to mention that.
So my question is for David Keiser, and it kind of builds on Sheila Olmsted's presentation. And the question really is, why facilities? Because, as we've heard about today, those are probably the most effectively regulated sources out there they seem like they might be pretty unlikely to correlate with severe water quality problems unless it's coming from something else. Yeah, you said CAFOs, so maybe CAFOs are a different story, but, and I guess if the answer is, well, that's where the data are, that's fair enough. But is it possible to do something like what you're doing where you look at actual water quality conditions rather than facilities to get a clearer sense of where the EJ impacts might be?
Great question. Part of the answer is that's where the data are. But also another part of it is just so far a time constraint on the research. But I think that one thing that we've been thinking about is, well, where could we start looking elsewhere as well? So you could imagine, like what this misses is that we currently haven't looked at, the national wetland inventory and looking at demographics nearby that. You could think about adding that in with this as well. In terms of water quality itself, I've done a lot of work looking at impacts of policies on water quality outcomes. That could be a natural place to look, but I also felt like that if EPA is moving forward in terms of doing these analyses for particular industries as they get regulated over time, then it would be interesting to know, well, where would we kind of expect to see this EJ type of analysis be most useful and helpful.
Any other questions? I'm just about out of time, so we can. Any parting words from the panel? Well, thank you very much. It was excellent.